This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 664, entitled Converting Women into Female Masculists in 5 minutes with Core Masculist Arguments. Description. This flyer shows how a masculist can convert a woman in a group conversation into a female masculist in just a few minutes using core masculist arguments. Now the flyer itself. Converting Women into Female Masculists in 5 minutes with Core Masculist Arguments by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Imagine my mouse is not. Imagine you're at a mixed-sex gathering in conversation, and somehow it comes up that you're a masculist, and some woman in the conversational group asks you what that means. You only have a minute or two to get your point across if the topic is to be pursued further, with, for example, the woman posing a second question saying, "What reasons do masculists have for thinking that men need a liberation movement?" End quote. What might your opening line be if the woman says to you, quote, "I hear that you're a masculist. What does that mean exactly?" End quote. As a masculist, you will really need to have your ducks in a row if you are to capture her attention so that the conversation continues and does not get deviated by some other topic. So what would I reply under such circumstances? I would probably say something along the following lines. Masculism is the obvious equivalent of the word feminism. That is, it's men's lib, liberating men from the oppressions that women and society impose on men. For example, women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, etc. Masculists want fundamental changes in society so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally. At the moment, most people have been heavily brainwashed by feminism that gender oppression is a one-way street. Well, it's not. It's very much a two-way street, that women oppress men too, and in fact worse than vice versa. For example, the 3 ways I just mentioned. With this initial salvo, probably, the woman might come back with a more challenging question, such as, "How do women manslave men?" Or, "What is divorce rape?" Or, "How do women force men into fatherhood?" If this happens, you have probably got her attention for a minute or so while you give her a quick answer to her question. Say she asks how women manslave men. You could answer briefly that, quote, "Take the case of a woman who makes no effort to become a FIP, a masculist term for a financially independent person. By masculist definition, she is a fluffy. That is, a woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving him for decades, which is a major gender crime in the eyes of the masculists, who see themselves as abolitionists, who see fluffydom as manslavery and manslavery as slavery, so is hated and a war issue to masculists. So masculists put tremendous moral pressure on women to fip up so that they are not fluffies. Masculists have a very powerful moral argument they use against fluffies, and that is that it was men who gave women science-based medicine, so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years, so have a career window of half a century, even those women who stay at home for some years while the kids are very small. It was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women the contraceptive pill, household gadgets, higher education, etc., so that women now can work, so must work. Anything else is seen by Masculists as being man's slavery. Masculists punish fluffies severely, effectively exterminating them by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, by expecting them to be FIPs who bother to get a career-competent education at high school and college so that they can be financially responsible FIPs as adults and not expect, fluffy style, to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life. Masculists push politically for the creation of a FIP society via the FIPPing of women, so the other two major gender crimes that women commit against men, that is the other two mentioned above, of divorce rape and forced fathering, can be removed by the fact that all women have become FIPs, end quote. By this stage in the conversation, some of the group may have wandered off due to lack of interest in the topic, which might include the woman, but let's say she is curious to know more, so she starts probing a bit more with a more detailed question. Quote, "How would a FIP society liberate men?" To which you could answer, quote, "You've probably heard of the butchering of married fathers in the feminist-controlled divorce courts. One father in 4 has his life destroyed in these slaughterhouses for men. In many countries, he will lose custody of his kids with a 90% probability. He will lose half his wealth and stuff to her. He will lose his house so that she can raise her kids in it. He'll be forced to make child payments to his kids, whom he will barely be allowed to see, maybe 2 weekend visits a month. If his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to FIP up, so that she remains a parasite off him after the divorce the way she was before the divorce. In a FIP society, that kind of thing would not happen, since the divorce courts would be based on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties, so that the ex-wife would be expected to be a FIP who could take care of herself financially. Custody of children would be joint by default, as it already is in several Western countries. There would be no halving of wealth or stuff, and certainly no alimony, labelled by British Masculists as the Parasites Charter. One of the main issues of the Masculists is the blatant sexual discrimination against men in the form of women having the MARA, that's maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, that is, that women have the legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men have no paternity rejection right, so that millions of women can force men into an unwanted pregnancy, thus forcing a man to pay for a kid for 2 decades that he never wanted in the first place. In a FIP society, a woman who gets pregnant while her boyfriend chooses to take the para, that is, he opts for his legal male right to reject an unwanted fatherhood, she can afford to raise the kid herself because she is a FIP. The para would allow a man to fill in a government para form, legally rejecting paternity, so that if the woman chooses to take the pregnancy to term, she then has full legal responsibility for the costs of the kid until it reaches adulthood. If the woman is a FIP, she can afford it. So, you can probably see why the Masculists are so keen on the creation of a FIP society, so as to overcome the big 3 gender crimes that women commit against men, that are natural consequences of the traditional gender roles of the woman being the housewife, of the women being the housewives who stay at home raising the many kids, and the men being the breadwinners who earn the money to keep himself, his kids, and his parasitic wife financially afloat. In the 70s, the feminists took over the divorce courts and gave women the right to a fault-free divorce, resulting in millions of divorcing fathers being butchered on a daily basis. These 70s feminist divorce court lawyers and judges knew nothing about masculism at the time, bringing with them their traditional expectations of men being the breadwinners. So after a divorce, it was natural for them to continue seeing men as cash machines, whose role in life was to continue to pay for women to raise kids. To Masculists, the core idea of Masculist ideology is that Masculism is essentially a rebellion against being man-slaves to women, working for women for decades of their lives. Masculists argue that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years and a career window of half a century, so now must work. Masculists punish severely women who don't FIP up, forcing them into slow, miserable deaths, rotting on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at, rejected utterly both socially and sexually, forcing millions of young women to become career competent so that they can pull their own financial weight as adults and not expect to be fluffy crappers who choose to study fluffy crap majors at high school and college, which will make them fluffies as adults and hence manslavers and divorce rapists. Masculists estimate today that about 80% of young women at age 16 choose to become fluffy crappers and hence doom themselves to be fluffies as adults. So, Masculists are very political. They want to see GECs, that's GECs, Gender Equality Committees, set up in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case today. The Masculist half of these GECs would push hard for the fipping of society, the legislation of the para, and the OPTAB, OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, to block women's paternity fraud, seen as a horrible gender crime that millions of women commit against men. It's quite possible that the woman listening to all this remarks, quote, "But what about the children? How can a woman be both a FIP with a demanding full-time career and raise very small children at the same time? It's just not practical." It sounds to me that if a FIP society is created, then the birth rate will only collapse further, wiping ourselves out. Look at South Korea, where the birth rate is only 0.7 children per woman, which is only a third of the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. So South Korea is destroying itself at a rapid rate, and many other countries are not far behind. End quote. As a Masculist, you can then reply, quote, "The Masculists propose their MCT to women, that is their mother career timeline, which for an upper middle class woman such as yourself would go as follows, which would allow her to be both a FIP and a mother of 2 kids, thus fulfilling her civic duty to meet the replacement rate. She gets her master's degree at 23. She then works for 5 years in her career competent major, during which time she marries. She then stops work for 6 years while she raises at home her 2 kids, having the first at age 29 and the second at 31. When the second one is off to kindergarten at age 4, she goes back to her career. During the 6 years she's at home, the government gives her a hefty maternity wage, arguing that it is the responsibility of all citizens to raise the next generation. Otherwise, we wipe ourselves out. This maternity wage removes the awful burden on the husband/father of being solely responsible for the financial well-being of the entire family." End quote. The woman, on hearing this, might say, in quotes, "Interesting. I think a lot of fluffy women are going to feel profoundly threatened by the Masculist pressure on them to FIP up. Also, it will take a lot of psychological adjustment on the part of feminists to accept the idea that gender oppression is a two-way street, after being taught by feminism for decades that gender oppression is a one-way street, that it is men who are the oppressors and women the oppressed. For such women to be told that women in fact oppress men worse will come as a real shock. I feel rather shocked by that idea, but your arguments relating to manslavery, divorce rape and forced fathering are compelling, so I can't argue against them. I'm going to have to stew on this. I wonder why I haven't been exposed to these ideas before on the media?" End quote. You reply, "Masculist ideas have crystallised pretty much now, so the time is ripe to spread them to the masses via the media. But the problem with that strategy is that in reality, the majority of journalists and media workers are female, who are monoconscious feminists, who have been profoundly brainwashed by feminism that gender oppression is a one-way street. So they react very negatively to masculist claims that women are worse gender oppressors than men. Masculists call these female journalists the fem mafia, that is, the feminist media mafia. But there are now so many millions of masculists and MGTOWs, in brackets that is, men going their own way, who reject the toxicity of marriage and paternity due to the toxicity of the divorce courts, who spend their money on themselves, close brackets, that there are now millions of conversations going on between men and women like the one we are having. So sooner or later, millions of women will be exposed to masculist ideas and see their strength, and maybe become female masculists, sympathetic to masculism, similar to the way that there are millions of male feminists who agree with what the feminists are saying about how men oppress women, for example, rape, domestic violence, sexual harassment, patriarchy, etc. With millions of female masculists, setting up the GECs will be made easier, since these female masculist women will vote with men for the establishment of the GECs, and with that, the legislation of the para, the OPTAB, etc., so that millions of men can be liberated from the oppressions of their manslavery, their divorce rape, their forced fathering, etc. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Brackets. Click on the Masculist tab for 660 plus Masculist essays and their videos. See also a London Real interview on masculism at AI Will Kill 1 Billion People - Do We Create Our Exterminators? Professor Hugo de Garis - London Real. Brackets. See the last half hour of this 2-hour interview for the Masculist segment. These flyers are available in text and video formats on